I never planned on becoming an Airbnb host. My grandmother left me her house when she passed, a small 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, and I couldn't bring myself to sell it, but I also couldn't afford to just let it sit empty while I paid the property taxes and utilities on a house I wasn't living in. A coworker convinced me that renting it out short-term would cover the costs and then some, so about 3 years ago I fixed the place up, took some decent photos, and listed it. For the most part, it went fine. Families on vacation, the occasional business traveler, nothing dramatic. Then, last winter, I got a booking request from a man named Douglas. His profile had no reviews, which normally makes me cautious, but his message was polite and detailed. He explained he was in town for a month-long work assignment doing some kind of contract engineering job and needed a quiet place to stay since hotels were too expensive for that length of time. He offered to pay the full month up front, which honestly made the decision easier than it probably should have. I approved the booking. The first 2 weeks, I barely heard from him. Every so often, I'd get a message asking about the thermostat or the Wi-Fi password, always polite, always brief. I didn't think much of it. Around the start of the 3rd week, my neighbor, an older woman named Carol who's lived next door to that house longer than I've been alive, texted me a photo she'd taken from her kitchen window. It showed a man standing in my grandmother's old garden at close to 11 at night, just standing there completely still, facing the house. Carol said she'd seen him out there a few nights in a row, always around the same time, never doing anything, just standing and looking up at the windows. I brushed it off at first, telling myself some people are just odd, and that standing outside at night isn't actually against any part of the rental agreement, strange as it might be. But then Carol sent another message a few days later saying she'd noticed the back door propped slightly open one afternoon while Douglas's car was parked out front and thought that was worth mentioning since the weather had turned cold enough that leaving a door open didn't make much sense. I decided to check the exterior camera I'd installed above the garage, the one piece of security equipment I do have and fully disclose in the listing. Scrolling back through the footage, I found the same pattern Carol described. Douglas walking out to the garden most nights around the same time, standing there for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, then walking back inside. On its own, it was strange, but not exactly alarming. What actually alarmed me was a clip from 4 days earlier, time-stamped just after 2 in the morning, showing Douglas carrying something long and wrapped in a tarp from his car into the house through the side door, moving carefully, checking over his shoulder twice before going inside. I sat with that clip for longer than I want to admit before deciding to message him directly, keeping my tone as neutral as I could manage, just asking if everything was going all right with the stay and mentioning I'd noticed some late-night activity on the camera. His response came almost immediately, which surprised me given how sparse his messaging had been up to that point. He said everything was fine, that he liked walking outside to clear his head after long work days, and that the item on the camera was just some equipment for a side project he was working on in his free time. It was a reasonable enough answer on paper. It just didn't sit right with me, the same way an answer can be technically fine and still leave you feeling like you asked the wrong question. His booking was set to end on the last day of the month, and honestly, I started counting down the days at that point, which isn't something I'd ever done with a guest before. On the actual checkout day, I drove over to do my usual walkthrough before the next guest's check-in, and his car was still in the driveway. I assumed he was just running late, so I let myself in through the front door using my own key, calling out to let him know I was there. The house was completely empty. His bags, his belongings, everything looked packed and ready to go, sitting by the front door like he'd been about to leave. But there was no sign of him anywhere on the main floor, and his car keys were sitting right there on the kitchen counter next to his suitcase. I checked upstairs, checked every bedroom, nothing. It was only when I went down to the basement, which I rarely use for anything besides storing my grandmother's old furniture, that I noticed the door to the old root cellar, a small stone room built into the foundation that I'd genuinely forgotten existed since it had been painted over and blocked with a bookshelf for as long as I could remember, was standing wide open, the bookshelf pulled aside. I called down into it before going any further, my voice echoing off stone that had probably been undisturbed for decades. No answer. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and stepped inside, and what I found down there is the part of this I still have the hardest time explaining. It wasn't empty storage space like I expected. There was a sleeping bag laid out on a piece of plywood, a small battery-powered lantern, and stacked along one wall, dozens of photographs, printed at some drugstore kiosk, all of them showing the house, my grandmother's house, from different angles and different years, some clearly recent, some so old. The print quality looked like it belonged to film photography from decades ago, long before Douglas could have possibly taken them himself. I didn't go any further into that room. I backed out, locked the door from the outside with an old padlock I found on a shelf nearby, and called the police from the driveway while sitting inside my own car with the doors locked. When officers searched the house and the root cellar, Douglas was gone, and so was whatever he'd carried in wrapped in that tarp weeks earlier. What they did find, tucked behind a loose stone in the cellar wall, was a small tin box containing several older photographs of my grandmother herself, standing in that same garden Carol had described him staring at every night, along with a few newspaper clippings from her obituary the year she passed. The police told me they believed Douglas had some prior connection to the house, possibly to my grandmother directly, though they were never able to track down his real identity, since the name and information on his booking profile turned out to belong to someone else entirely, a man in another state who'd had his identity used without his knowledge months earlier. The car in the driveway was registered to that same stolen identity and was eventually towed and never claimed. I still own the house. I still rent it out sometimes, though I sealed that cellar behind a solid wall instead of just a bookshelf, and I check every camera angle obsessively now before approving any new booking. Every so often, usually late at night, Carol will still text me from next door, just to say she thought she saw someone standing in the garden again. I always tell her it's probably nothing. I don't know if I actually believe that anymore, but I don't know what else there is to say to her, or to myself, about a man who knew that house better than I ever will, and whose real face I still have never seen. I've told this story to maybe 5 people in my life, and every single one of them asked me the same question first. Why didn't I just leave the second it started? I still don't have a good answer for that, other than to say that when something is happening to you in real time, it never feels as obvious as it does after the fact. 2 years ago, I had a work conference in a city I'd never been to before, and since the company was only covering 3 of the 5 nights I'd be there, I booked an extra couple of nights on my own through Airbnb to save some money instead of extending the hotel block. I found a studio apartment listed by a host named Priya. Decent reviews, decent location, a 10-minute walk from the conference center. The unit itself was on the 4th floor of an older apartment building that had clearly been converted. Some units still lived in by regular tenants, others clearly turned into short-term rentals like mine. The listing mentioned a keypad entry code that would be sent the day of check-in, which is pretty standard, so I didn't think twice about it. I checked in on a Tuesday evening after my flight got in late. The code worked fine on the building's main door, and again on the apartment door itself. Inside, it was a small but clean studio, decorated in that generic neutral way most of these places are. Gray couch, white walls, a couple of framed prints that clearly came from the same big box store every host seems to shop at. I dropped my bags, ordered food, and passed out early because my flight had been brutal. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the apartment door unlocking. Not someone knocking. The actual deadbolt turning, followed by the door opening. I sat straight up in bed, and for a second I genuinely thought I was dreaming, because who breaks into an apartment by using the actual lock instead of forcing it open? A woman's voice called out from the front hallway, asking who was in her apartment. Her apartment. Not confused, not testing the waters, saying it like a fact she was certain of. I turned the bedside lamp on and told her I had booked this place through Airbnb, that I had a code that worked, that I wasn't trying to steal anything. She stood in the doorway staring at me like I'd grown a second head. She said she'd lived in that unit for almost 3 years, and she had no idea what I was talking about, and she wanted to know how I got in. I showed her the confirmation email on my phone, the booking details, the host's name, Priya. She read it over twice, her face going from angry to something closer to scared, and told me she had never heard that name before in her life. We were both standing there 1 in the morning trying to figure out what was happening, and honestly, for a few minutes it felt less like a horror story and more like an incredibly awkward misunderstanding neither of us knew how to fix. She called the building's after-hours line, and while she was on hold, I looked around the studio again with fresh eyes, and that's when the wrongness of it really hit me. There was a coffee mug in the drying rack with a faded university logo chipped on the handle, definitely not the kind of anonymous decor an Airbnb host buys in bulk. There was a jacket hanging by the door that clearly wasn't mine and clearly had been worn, not staged. This apartment wasn't a rental unit at all. It was someone's actual home, and somehow I had a working code to get inside it. The building's overnight security guard showed up about 15 minutes later, a heavy-set guy who looked more annoyed than concerned, until she explained the situation to him, at which point his expression changed fast. He checked the building's master log for that unit's smart lock, since apparently the whole building had been upgraded to digital locks the year before, tied into a central system the property management company controlled. He pulled it up on a tablet, and his face went pale. According to the log, a temporary access code had been generated for that specific door 2 days earlier by someone using management-level credentials set to expire in 5 days, not the tenant's code. A separate one, layered on top of hers, that she never knew existed and never approved. That was the part that really got to me. Whoever did this didn't hack anything or pick a lock. They had access to the building's own management system, the kind only building staff or the software company itself should have, and used it to quietly generate a rental code for an apartment that was never listed anywhere by its actual resident. I wasn't in some scam listing for a fake unit. I was in a real one, and someone with real authority inside that system had rented it out from under a woman who had no idea it was happening. The security guard let her stay in the lobby with me while he called the property management emergency line, and while we waited, she told me something that made my skin crawl even more than everything up to that point. She said over the past month she kept noticing small things out of place when she got home from work. A chair pushed in slightly differently than she remembered leaving it. A window cracked open that she was sure she'd shut. She chalked it up to being tired and forgetful, the kind of thing you talk yourself out of because the alternative is too unsettling to sit with. She'd never once considered that someone might actually be letting themselves in. Management didn't get back to us with anything useful until almost 4 in the morning, at which point they offered to comp me a hotel room for the rest of my stay and told her they'd be investigating internally, which felt like the kind of answer companies give when they don't actually know what happened and don't want to say that out loud. I grabbed my bags and left. She walked me down to the lobby herself, and I remember her thanking me for waking up when I did, saying if I'd slept through it, she might have walked in on someone else entirely, someone who wasn't there to work from a laptop for a few nights. I never found out who Priya actually was. The listing vanished from the app within a day, and when I tried messaging the host account for any kind of explanation, it came back undeliverable, like the account itself had been wiped. I did get an email a few weeks later from Airbnb's trust and safety team asking me a handful of questions about my stay, phrased carefully enough that I got the sense this wasn't the first time they'd heard something like this. The tenant and I exchanged numbers that night in case either of us heard anything more. About 6 months later, she texted me out of nowhere. She said management had quietly swapped her lock system for a different one entirely, no explanation given, and that she'd since found out from a neighbor that at least one other unit in the building had a similar issue that same year, though the resident there had never noticed anything wrong because they'd been out of town the entire week their code was active. I still think about that. About how many nights she might have slept in that apartment with a stranger's code sitting quietly in the system, waiting for someone to use it, and how the only reason she ever found out was because, for once, someone actually did. I used to think I was good at reading people. After this trip, I don't trust that instinct anymore, and honestly, I don't think I ever will again. Last spring, my company let a chunk of us work remote for 2 weeks straight, no real reason given other than some office renovation. I decided to use that time to get out of my apartment and actually see something other than my kitchen wall. I found this lake house listing about 3 hours from where I live. Cheap, private, good reviews, and the photos looked like something out of a magazine. Wood beams, a deck over the water, a fire pit. The host's name was Warren. His profile picture showed an older guy, maybe mid-50s, standing next to a boat. Every review mentioned how quiet and clean the place was. A few people even said Warren left them a bottle of wine and a handwritten note. It felt like exactly what I needed. I drove up on a Sunday afternoon. The directions were a little strange, 3 different turns that weren't on my GPS, but Warren had texted them ahead of time, and once I found the driveway, the place looked even better in person than in the photos. The lockbox code worked fine. Inside, everything smelled like cedar and fresh laundry. There was a note on the counter, just like the reviews promised, welcoming me and telling me to help myself to anything in the fridge. I remember texting my sister a picture of the deck and telling her I was never leaving. The first 2 days were genuinely great. I worked from the dining table with a view of the water, took walks in the evening, and slept better than I had in months. It was on the third night that I noticed the smoke detector in the living room had a light that blinked at a strange rhythm. Most smoke detectors I've had just do a single red pulse every so often. This one blinked twice, paused, then blinked twice again, over and over. I told myself it was probably just a different brand, some detectors are wired differently, and went back to my book. The next morning I couldn't shake it. I'm not an electrician, but something about the pattern bothered me the whole time I was making coffee. I looked it up on my phone, just typing in the brand name that was printed on the side of the unit, and the model that came up online didn't have a light that blinked at all. Not unless it was low on battery, and even then, it was a single chirp, not a rhythm. I stood on a kitchen chair and looked at it closer. There was a tiny pinhole on the front casing, off to the side of the actual smoke sensor, small enough that I almost dismissed it as a manufacturing seam. I took a picture with my phone zoomed all the way in, and when I looked at the photo, I could see a faint reflection inside that hole. Glass. A lens. My stomach dropped. I didn't touch it. I just got down off the chair and stood in the middle of the living room trying to figure out if I was overreacting. I told myself, plenty of hosts have cameras in common areas for security, and that it's technically legal as long as it's disclosed and not in a bedroom or bathroom. Nothing in the listing mentioned cameras anywhere. I checked the listing 3 times to be sure. I decided to check the rest of the house before I let myself spiral. The bedroom I was staying in had a decorative clock on the dresser, one of those old-fashioned analog ones with a wooden frame. It was facing the bed directly, which struck me as an odd choice for furniture placement in general, and when I picked it up, it was heavier than a clock should be. I turned it over. There was a seam along the back panel that didn't match the rest of the wood grain, like it had been cut and glued back differently than the original piece. I didn't have a screwdriver small enough to open it right there, so I set it face down in a drawer instead and told myself I'd deal with it later. That night, I barely slept. Every time I woke up, I stared at that dresser, half expecting to see a light blinking from inside the drawer. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a car on the gravel driveway outside. Not pulling in, just slowing down and then continuing past. I told myself it was probably someone lost, or a neighbor coming home late, since the road curved right past the house. But then, about 20 minutes later, I heard it again. Same slow crawl, same stretch of gravel. I looked out the window and saw taillights disappearing around the bend. No headlights facing the house, which meant it was already turned around and driving away by the time I looked. The next morning, I messaged Warren directly, keeping my tone light, just asking if there happened to be any security cameras in the common areas that maybe weren't listed. He responded fast, faster than any of his previous messages, and said there was only one camera mounted outside above the front door for package deliveries, and that it wasn't recording indoors. I told him I thought I might have found something inside a smoke detector and a clock. There was a long pause before his next message. He said that was strange, and that he'd never installed anything like that, and maybe a past guest left something behind, and he'd look into it. That answer didn't sit right with me. If a stranger had planted hidden cameras in a rental he owned, most hosts I've dealt with would be alarmed, would want me to call the police immediately, would want details right away. Warren just said he'd look into it, like it was a broken faucet. I decided I wasn't waiting around for him to look into anything. I started going through the house room by room with my phone flashlight, checking every object that had a seam, a hole, a strange angle. In the office nook off the kitchen, there was a small wooden owl figurine on a bookshelf, the kind you'd find at a craft fair, positioned facing the desk chair exactly where I'd been sitting for 2 straight days doing video calls. Its glass eyes didn't look quite right up close. One was slightly darker than the other, almost too dark, like it wasn't actually eye-colored glass at all. That was when I stopped being calm about it. I packed my bag in about 10 minutes flat, threw everything into my car without organizing it, and drove straight to the small diner about 15 minutes down the main road, the only place I'd seen that had lights on and a parking lot with other cars in it. I sat in a booth and called the local police non-emergency line, and an officer met me there about 20 minutes later. I explained everything. He didn't seem surprised, which somehow made it worse. He told me they'd had 2 other complaints about short-term rentals in the area over the past year, though nothing had ever been confirmed enough to bring charges. He followed me back to the house in his own vehicle so I could show him what I'd found. When we walked in, the smoke detector's light was off. Not blinking, not glowing red, just dark. I pointed at it anyway and told him it had been blinking the whole time I stayed there. He took it down and opened it right there in the living room. Inside was a tiny camera module, no bigger than a fingernail, wired into what looked like a battery pack instead of the smoke detector's actual components. The wooden clock in the bedroom had the same setup. The owl figurine's eye came apart with a small twist, revealing a lens smaller than a pencil eraser. The officer bagged everything and told me they'd be reaching out to the property owner listed on the county records. That was the part that really got under my skin. The name on file wasn't Warren. It was a woman's name I didn't recognize, someone who, according to the tax record, had owned the property for over 11 years and, as far as the officer could tell from a quick search, had no listed connection to any short-term rental account. I never got a real answer for who Warren actually was, or whether he was the one who installed the cameras, or if he was just a fake identity someone used to run guests through that house while somebody else watched from wherever those feeds were going. My booking got refunded within an hour of me leaving a review, and the listing itself disappeared from the site less than a week later, along with Warren's entire host profile, reviews and all, like the account had simply been deleted from existence. About 2 months after I got home, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small wooden coaster, the same style as the ones that had been sitting on the coffee table in that lake house, the kind with a painted loon on it that you'd buy at any lake town gift shop. There was no note. I checked, twice, turning it over and running my fingers along every seam, half convinced I'd find another lens hidden somewhere inside it. I didn't find anything, but I still haven't been able to throw it away, and I still haven't been able to make myself book another rental with a host I haven't met in person first. My friend Colin and I have a tradition where every year around our birthdays, which happen to fall about a week apart, we plan some kind of trip together, just the 2 of us. Nothing extravagant, usually a cabin somewhere quiet where we can fish, drink too much, and pretend we're not both turning older than we'd like to admit. Last year it was his turn to pick the location, and he found a cabin listed as being deep in the mountains, marketed as completely off-grid, solar-powered, no neighbors for miles. The photos looked incredible. A wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, a hot tub overlooking a ridgeline. The host went by the name Garrett, and his profile picture was a guy in his 40s wearing a flannel jacket, standing next to a truck. The listing description mentioned that once you were about 40 miles out from the nearest town, cell service disappeared completely, and that Garrett would leave a printed set of directions in the welcome packet since GPS tended to lose signal on the final stretch of dirt road. That detail should have bothered me more than it did at the time. Instead, I thought it sounded like a nice break from being glued to my phone for a few days. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, and just like the listing warned, our phones lost signal almost exactly 40 miles out, right as the paved road turned to gravel and then eventually to dirt. We followed Garrett's printed directions, which were handwritten, not typed, with little landmarks noted along the way, like a fallen tree shaped like an arch and a rusted mailbox with no name on it. It took us almost 2 hours longer than expected to actually find the cabin, mostly because 2 of the landmarks he described didn't match anything we could see, and we ended up backtracking twice. When we finally pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the photos, which honestly surprised me given how often that's not the case. There was a lockbox on the porch with a code that worked, and inside, everything was clean and stocked, with a handwritten welcome note from Garrett wishing us a great stay and reminding us that if we needed anything, there was a landline phone in the kitchen connected through a satellite system, since regular cell service was non-existent out there. The first night was genuinely fun. We built a fire, drank a few beers, and joked about how we were basically the beginning of every horror movie we'd ever seen, cell phones useless, no neighbors, deep in the woods. We laughed about it. I wish we hadn't said it out loud, honestly, though I know that's not how any of this actually works. It was the second night when things started feeling wrong. Colin got up around midnight to get water and came back into the bedroom saying he thought he saw a light moving through the trees, off toward the ridge behind the cabin. Not headlights, since there was no road out there, just a single light bobbing slowly like someone was walking with a flashlight. We watched from the window for a few minutes and didn't see it again, and told ourselves it was probably another cabin further out that we hadn't noticed on the map, even though the listing had specifically said there weren't any neighbors for miles. The next morning, we found a trail camera strapped to a tree about 30 yards from the back porch, angled directly at the cabin's back door instead of out toward the woods like a hunting camera normally would be. Colin has hunted his whole life and said right away that no one sets a game camera facing a building unless they're not actually trying to catch game. We didn't have a way to check what was on the memory card, but just finding it there, silently pointed at us for who knows how long, put both of us on edge for the rest of the day. We used the satellite landline to call Garrett that afternoon, and I remember how strange the call felt, this brief window of static-filled connection to the outside world. He answered fast, almost too fast, and when we told him about the camera, he said it belonged to a neighboring property owner who sometimes strayed onto his land, and that he'd have a word with him. He said it so casually, like this was a known ongoing issue rather than something alarming, which didn't sit right with either of us, especially given the listing claimed there weren't any neighbors at all. That night, neither of us slept much. Around 2 in the morning, we heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, circling the entire perimeter of the cabin. We turned off every light inside and sat in the dark kitchen with the fireplace poker in Colin's hand, listening as the footsteps made a full loop around the building twice before stopping directly outside the back door where the trail camera had been mounted. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like 10 full minutes. We could hear breathing through the door, slow and steady, like they weren't in any hurry at all. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps walked away and everything went quiet. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light, we decided we were leaving, listing be damned, refund or no refund. While we were packing the car, Colin noticed something taped to the inside of the windshield that hadn't been there the day before. A folded piece of paper, the same handwriting style as the welcome note from Garrett, except this note wasn't welcoming at all. It just said that the road out gets washed out sometimes after rain, and that we should be careful on the way down, and to enjoy the rest of our stay. Nothing about it was threatening on paper, but the timing of it, appearing overnight on a car parked in a driveway 40 miles from another human being, made both of us feel like we were being watched from somewhere close by even as we read it. We drove out as fast as the dirt road would let us. About halfway down, exactly at the spot where the road curved around a steep drop, we found a fallen tree blocking half the lane, freshly cut, sawdust still pale and damp around the stump, not the kind of thing that happens naturally in a single storm. There was enough room to squeeze the car past it if we took the shoulder carefully, which we did, both of us not saying a word the entire time, just focused on getting past that spot. Once we hit the point where our phones picked up a single bar of signal, we pulled over and called the local sheriff's office for that county. An officer took our report over the phone and told us, somewhat reluctantly, that they'd received 2 other calls about that same property over the past year, though nothing had ever been substantiated enough to act on, since guests always left before anyone could investigate and the property owner on record was different from the host name listed on the app. We never found out who Garrett actually was, or whether he was even a real person connected to that land at all, or just a name attached to a listing for a cabin that belonged to someone using it for something the actual owner might not have even known about. The listing disappeared from the platform less than 2 weeks later. Colin still has a screenshot of the note that was left on our windshield, and every once in a while he'll send it to me with no caption, just to remind me that we still don't know who wrote it, or how they knew we'd be leaving that morning before we'd even decided to leave ourselves.